Hey everyone, this is Zan. I'm going to be talking about the Late Age Agartha National Overview. As usual, we're going to start with their national features, but also we're going to dip into their national summary. I think the stories of the Dominion's five nations tend to be pretty compelling and interesting. So the history of Agartha is that they were a set of caverns below a magical site known as the Roots of the Earth that were filled with these large cyclopean humanoids who at some point, once they met the humans, were coined Pale Ones. And these Pale Giants, in a folly, attempted to attack and conquer the overworld, which ended up failing miserably. As a last ditch effort to win their war, they broke an ancient seal that was deep in their caverns to unleash a false god of destruction. As you may have thought, this did not go very well for them, and they became almost extinct. Humans began to colonize these caverns, and initially they worked together. The Agarthans were considered almost sacred, especially their statues. Unfortunately, those became destroyed in a second Great War, and now all that remains are the mummified corpses of most Pale Ones. So the Agarthans has turned to worshipping these mummified giants and kind of ignoring themselves. So Agarthan used to mean these pale giants, but now it does mean a pale, large-eyed humanoid, interestingly enough. And they worship these mummies, but their own, I guess, dead are not considered sacred and are actually used for menial tasks and warfare, kind of similar to necromantic Urmor, or more actually Celeria, not Urmor. If we ever get to those, then we'll talk more about that then. Anyways, their national features are going to be humans with limited dark vision, as account for those big eyes that were mentioned. And they get extra gold and resources in cave forts. I guess their understanding of how to properly colonize these deep cave locations. Their military is comprised of light and heavy infantry with steel crossbows and cave knights. There's an emphasis there on steel crossbows, and we can get to that once we actually talk about their units. Their magic is comprised of earth, death, fire, and some astral. It should also really mention water. I think their water magic is as good as their fire magic, so it's weird it's not there. And that's a pretty interesting set of magic because a lot of players really like earth and death magic, especially in the late game. Their priests are average, which is fair, and they have standard forts for the age, which in late age means citadels. Let's talk about Late Age Agartha's recruitable units. They come in a few varieties, but mostly it's going to be infantry of all kinds, light, medium, heavy, and super heavy. Crossbowmen in the same varieties, although there's no super heavy crossbowmen. That would be pretty cool. An engineer whose job is to break forts, and a dragon riding knight who can be impressive in certain situations, but not always. Let's dive right in. So their infantry come in three varieties. They have the Agarthan light infantry, they've got the regular infantry, and the heavy infantry. For the most part, I feel like you should just alternate between the Agarthan heavy infantry and the Agarthan light infantry, the light infantry being used in situations where maybe protection doesn't matter as much, or maybe you just need bodies on the field. And then the heavy infantry, whose actual job is to die slowly. They are very gold light and recruitment point light. They just need a lot of production for their armor because it's not a very skilled soldier itself, but he has very good equipment placed on him. A kite shield is a very good shield in this game, probably one of the better ones to give recruitable units. And full chainmail is very strong as a piece of armor. Onto their crossbowmen, again, you have a light crossbowman, a regular crossbowman, and a heavy crossbowman. And one oversight, I think, for the nation is I wish how this light crossbowman has this ringmail cuirass with no penalties on it. I wish that the light infantry also had that same cuirass. They'll lose 1 point of protection, but then they'll get 1 point of defense, and they'll lose a point of encumbrance. But more importantly, they get their map move back. I also think that the light infantry should have a kite shield instead of a regular shield. And I think that would boost their stats even more and really make this light infantry unit a very good unit as opposed to some of the other ones. Because the situation where you don't really care about protection tends to be in the very late game, and it doesn't come up as often as you caring about protection. So I think swapping this unit to a Rainmail Cuirass and a Kite Shield would be ideal, but for now, let's keep talking about what we currently have. When it comes to the Crossbowmen, you're going to notice that they have these Agarthan steel crossbows, as mentioned in the summary, and they have extra precision to make up for the Agarthan's lack of precision. Those big eyes don't do well in the sun. And they have extra damage, which is actually kind of cool when compared to some of the other national crossbows. Also, being an Earth nation, you're likely to buff your crossbowmen to give it even more damage and make their crossbows very, very deadly to unexpected enemies. Now, one thing to keep in mind is since they do come in these varieties of armor, they all cost the same gold and have the same recruitment points, although their map move is different, but you're usually only moving one province at a time. This is probably the only one that can move two at once. And essentially, if you need more crossbows on the field, you recruit this guy. If you have leftover resources, you recruit this guy. And if you're fighting a nation, such as Late Age TNG, that relies or has a lot of archery, Late Age TNG, I think Man also has longbowmen, you might want to recruit heavy crossbowmen because they're going to perform better in ranged duels. And if you've seen my Late Age Agartha playthrough, you're going to notice most of the fights that I fight enemy ranged units, I do actually start using these heavy crossbowmen, and I have them on attack archers or fire archers. So they kind of force into these ranged duels, and they fire at each other. But the heavy crossbowmen will tend to come out on top because they do have better armor. They're absolute trash in melee, so don't have any hope for them there. But they're going to be more resistant to arrow fire. Again, if you're not really worried about them being attacked by like wolves or shot by archers, then yeah, just get these guys because you get more of them for your resources. Moving on to the super heavy infantry, you have the entrance guard, which is quite gold expensive now compared to some of the other infantry you had, and also recruitment point expensive. But they have a lot more hit points to kind of make up for that gold cost, and we all know I like when my hit points are very close to my gold cost. That makes, to me, it feels like it's an efficient use of my gold. They have better stats across the board, and even defense, despite the fact that they're weighing full plate mail, that has a lot of damn penalties assigned to it. Their encumbrance is through the roof, their map move is atrocious, their combat speed is very poor. But that's okay, because slow combat speed for your front line means that the battle will gravitate toward your side of the battlefield, which means that your relatively inaccurate mages and crossbowmen are now going to be more accurate because the fight is closer to them. Whereas if the opponent does not have their mages on advance and cast, which happens way more often than it should, their spells, inversely, are going to be less accurate. So that's something to keep in mind for. Going back to the stats on the entrance guard, they come with a castle defense bonus of 2, which is pretty significant in that they now have 1.6 siege defense per body. A traditional human just has 0.5. So 3 humans still don't match the siege defense of this one guy. And that is pretty good. Ideally, you don't want to be defending your castles or relying on that defense bonus for your castles to not go down. You want to be on the offensive. But it is still a good bonus to have and can definitely mess with a lot of enemies. I've done some neat tricks with Late Age Man in that, but that's another video. Other than that, they do have 50% dark vision, which is going to synergize with a lot of the later topics we'll talk around the nation. And their short sword does slightly more damage, which is useful, but their job is not to kill things. Not until later anyways. The other super heavy infantry they have is the Blind Fighter, and we can actually talk about this for a while, but I'm going to try to keep it short. It's essentially a sacred entrance guard. Its dark vision is now Spirit Sight, and it is blind, which means not only does it synergize better with darkness, the spell, but it also synergizes with Solar Brilliance, which blinds everyone to the battlefield. These guys will be unaffected. They have a better helmet, and that better helmet actually has no penalties assigned to it. I think the entrance guard one does, yes. So it is better than a full helmet for the same resources, but has no penalty with it. So that's interesting. Other than that, it has almost all the same stats, but it has more attack skill. And I think better defense. Let me verify. No, same defense, but just significantly more attack skill, which is interesting. And it has a lot better magic resistance. Overall, this is a pretty damn good unit to be recruiting. It's expensive and hard to mass, sure, but it's any fort. This is not a cap-only sacred. The big issues with it, there are 2 big issues with it. Maybe 3. One, this is the one I hate the most, and I think is the most prohibitive to using the unit, is that it is a magic being. This later in the game is not an issue, but early on means that if you want to field your blind fighters, you need to either recruit blind lords, which we'll talk about. It is a commander whose only purpose is to be a very thick commander with a lot of magic leadership to lead these guys, or recruit mages and have your mages move out in the field to lead these guys. I think both are bad because early on you might not have a lot of forts yet, and here you are funneling your capital recruitment points just to lead these guys. Not many other nations have to do that. And I don't think that's fair to the blind fighters because they are not so exceptional that they demand this additional burden just to bring them out to fight. The second thing that makes these guys pretty difficult to use is that a lot of your bless to use these guys is pretty much just the ticket to ride. Because to work well with the Agarthan army, as the turns progress, early on, yeah, it doesn't matter. They can go like this. But as the turns progress, to work well with the Agarthan army, they're likely going to need cold resistance. They're likely going to need poison resistance. They probably need some sort of magical weapon to just be useful in the later game. And they don't have any of that. So I feel like most of your bless for this character is spent just bringing them, just being able to making them able to participate in the fights and, be effective. Because you do care about them dying. You don't really care about your entrance guard dying. These are mundane troops. Their upkeep is expensive. Granted, I think it's similar. Yeah, their upkeep's expensive. Mundane troops, yeah, you want to buy them. You want them to go kill things, and you want them to die because you don't want to pay them. Sacreds that are hard to mask, like blind fighters, you don't necessarily want them to die, even though that is their job. Their job is to go out in the field and die so that the rest of your army can do things. So the blind fighter is an interesting one. And there's a whole ton of debate that's ever been had about it. And the too long didn't read version of it is I don't think you should use blind fighters early on in the game. I think you should start transitioning to blind fighters once you have your second, third, fourth forts up, and you're able to actually bring them in enough numbers that matters. Which is an interesting thing because now you can design a bless around having them later in the game as opposed to early. And that can definitely be interesting. But that's definitely a topic for another video. I think I touched upon it a lot in my late age Agartha pretender design, but this is just the overview. The Agarthan Sapper has one job and one job only. Do not be distracted by this cave fire bottle. It only has an ammo of 1. His one job is to be a bodyguard for your commanders that are placed in safe locations and have a siege bonus. That's it. It is 20 gold for 8 siege strength, 8.2 siege strength. A regular human has 1 siege strength. So this guy is as good, he is better than 8 regular dudes for 20 gold. That is very good. He suffers from the same issue that the light infantry has. I wish this full leather armor was swapped for a ringmail armor, because that would bring him up to 14 mat move, and this is the kind of unit that having more mat move on him would actually be good, because you don't really want them participating in the major battles. You want them to come in after and break down the walls. So I think moving this guy to a ringmail armor would help too. And then the final unit to talk about, of the recruitable units, is the Cave Knight. This guy's got 2 jobs. His first job is to expand. This is probably one of the better expanders in the game, probably on par with units such as the Noble for early HTNG. It is probably one of the better expanders in the game because it has, for fighting independence, very high defense with very high protection and 2 attacks that are actually pretty damaging. Like that damaging bite is really good. And then of note, he actually has a broadsword instead of a short sword. And I think in the late age, broadswords are better than short swords because it forces the slashing damage versus the piercing. And it has, I think, an additional point of damage on it. So overall, he's probably your most damaging melee unit by far. And it has decent defense. The issues that it comes with are it has very high recruitment points all of a sudden because it is a knight and it is a noble Rider, and it is very gold expensive. It is 80 gold for one of these guys, which is tough. Early on, that's fine. You can pump these guys out of your capital, but later, other provinces, you might struggle a bit. Now, that doesn't mean that they're bad. They're expensive, but that does not mean they're bad. They're expensive and they're very good. Their size is 4, which is perfect, because that means another unit can fit in a square with it. A square with 3 Agarthans has 3 attacks, even if one of them is a Cave Knights. And actually, you want that because this bite attack is your most damaging hit on your nation in melee, which is crazy. Now, if the Rider dies, because it only has 13 hit points, and again, I like hit points being close to gold, you lose the Rider permanently, but you get to keep the Cave Drake that gets left behind, meaning his stats get a lot lower, but the protection goes up, I believe, to 22, and the hit points go up to like 40 something. The rest of the stats, they're gone. Oh, and it becomes undisciplined. But, you're still left with something after the Rider has died to some unfortunate accident while fighting independence or what have you. Which still makes this a good unit to fighting independence because, man, independents struggle to get through 22 protection. Obviously, barbarians and heavy cavalry lances will do fine. But overall, this is probably fine. Later on, you can try to use these to raid the enemy because, small amounts of them, like 1 or 2 of them beat up province defense, like 6 province defense will die to 1 or 2 of these guys. But that's still kind of expensive. I don't know. But yeah, their primary purpose is just get you going out of the gate because they're really good at it. And that's what I would usually recommend them for. All right, that's it with the recruitable units. Let's move on to their commanders, and then we'll talk about their summonable units and commanders. Let's now talk about the recruitable commanders for the nation. We're going to start with a bog standard scout, the only difference being it has low light vision. We have a cave captain, which is actually pretty good in that it's 70 gold for 80 leadership, which does have a +1 morale bonus, and formations. We also have a gate lord, which is a 2 commander point cost, but for 110 gold, you're going to get a pretty durable commander with 120 leadership, meaning there's a +2 morale bonus, and it also has a defense bonus of 10. This guy's a monster at keeping a fort up. It is as good as 11 regular humans, and that's pretty cool. But otherwise, it does have that 2 recruitment point cost. We have a Drake Lord, which also has a 2 recruitment point cost, a 120 gold cost, and 120 leadership. It's up to you whether you want a Gate Lord or a Drake Lord. They're fairly similar in what they do. The Drake Lord is probably a better, I guess, thug if you want to go try to do that. But I think the Gate Lord is overall a better commander because you don't really care about this castle defense bonus. I don't think it's I don't think it's something you should plan around using. But if push comes to shove, I'd rather have these guys with their castle defense bonus than these guys with their nothing. Because again, they do have the same similar leadership styles. They have the same mat move. So honestly, yeah, I'd rather have a Gate Lord. Now again, both of these cost 2 commander points, so you might not really have many of them anyways. You also have a Blind Lord, and the Blind Lord has only a 1 commander point cost. It is more expensive at 140 gold, but it is a sacred blind fighter with really good morale, and again, it's all super durable. But more importantly, it has a magic leadership of 40, which means it can lead 40 blind fighters. And it's actually kind of interesting because you can combine the leadership and magic leadership into one pool of units. So let me back out of all this, see if I have something. Yeah, so see this guy here, Recruitable the Prophet. He's got 35 blind fighters held, so you see his magic leadership's 35 out of 40. I can add these entrance guard, which are mundane, to that same squad. There are no penalties. And he's starting to use his regular leadership. So what I'm getting at with that is that although this guy, for 1 commander point, has leadership of 80, if you combined this regular leadership with 40 magical leadership, he technically has 120, just the same as the other guys, but he costs only 1 recruitment point, or 1 commander point, instead of 2, which is interesting. So you can have 80 crossbowmen and then 40 blind fighters with this guy, and he is as good as the others. I mean, he doesn't provide that +2 morale, But in terms of actually just moving troops around, he's as good. Now let's finally talk about their mages. Their mages can be interesting in that they have this guy who his job is to be a priest. His paths are mediocre. You can do things with them, don't get me wrong. But in the scheme of Late Agartha, they're kind of mediocre. So it's 100 gold for his priest. He's your research monkey. This guy, early on, you might not want too many of them, maybe a few just to build temples. But you don't want too many of them early on. Maybe later, you might want to put Lightless Lanterns, a very good research booster, on them, and they're probably good for that. But the key mages of the nation are going to be this guy, the Ketonian Reanimator. He has 135 gold cost, but he is mundane and comes with 3 paths, which are pretty good for combat, actually, because he can Iron Skin himself to make himself fairly resistant to enemy fighting stuff. Iron Skin, Temper Flesh. Temper Flesh, I think, might not be as useful, but he can definitely do something to protect himself. And then he can having Death 2 magic, he's going to be able to cast like Horde of Skeletons, Shadow Blast, some other crazy stuff that is pretty not bad in combat. And then he's not a terrible researcher. He's not, perfectly gold efficient, 135 gold for 11 research points, but he's not bad. Some of them tend to be old, but that's okay. But otherwise, they have 16 mat move, and that makes this guy a pretty decent raider. Also a good, I guess, rapid response force to the enemy if you just have this guy come out and start skelly spamming. So he's not bad at all. He comes out with this little soulless dude who maybe can bait arrows away from him. Maybe. I mean, it's just kind of nice to have. So he's pretty important as your rank and file combat mage, I guess. But then you also have the Ketonian Alchemist. And again, same stats as the other guy, doesn't matter. But he's got 4 paths for 135 gold, which I think is actually absurdly cheap. My whole thing is that 1 path, on average, should be about 50 gold. So 4 paths should be 200 gold. So this guy's 135. That is fantastic. So that makes him actually a very capable researcher. You're paying 2 recruitment point costs for 13 research points for 135 gold. This guy's as good as a mystic. And you get 4 paths. That's pretty damn good. Now, the 4 paths, Fire, Water, Earth, they're all 1, which is kind of poo, but then his random is either he's going to get a 2 in one of those initial 3 paths, or he's going to get Death 1. And really, the only one you don't want, at least I don't want, is that Death 1 path. I want him to be a Fire 2. He's going to cast Flaming Arrows. He's going to cast Phoenix Power and then like Incinerate. He's going to be real good. I want that Water 2 path. He's going to cast Quickness. He's going to cast Wave Warriors. He's going to cast Frostbend. He's going to do things. He's going to with Water 2, you can go up to as high water as you want, honestly. So that's really good. An Earth 2 is never bad. You are going to have a lot of Earth 2s or better in this nation, but an Earth 2 is never bad to have. He's going to buff your troops. He's going to cast Miles of the Earth. He's going to cast Iron Warriors. Iron Warriors is kind of key. Like if you have too many quote-unquote Earth 2s, then they just cast Iron Warriors, and you have kind of Army of Gold, but earlier. It's kind of crazy. It's just that the Death 1 guy, that he doesn't do too much, so you just kind of leave him home as a researcher. If you do Crystal Matrix Communions, which I think you should later on, this guy could be a good Communion slave since he has wide paths. The last thing to mention is this Alchemist 50 is usually a terrible trait until it really, really isn't. And to give you the example, there's one game I have right now where I'm a little gold poor, but that's okay because I just found, as I'm fighting a war with someone, the first province I took from them has an alchemist site, and man, I have never been so happy to pay 300 gold for an alchemist because I can get that alchemist, give him fire boosters to make him fire 4, and he's going to be able to transmute fire gems for me, of which I have an abundance of, to I think it mathed out to a little under 40 gold per gem. That's pretty darn good. I can even probably go to the chat and start telling people, hey, I'll buy your fire gems from you for 30 gold a gem. People will probably do it. And I'm trying to make a deal in that game right now. There's someone with Construction 8. And I'm trying to make a deal with that person. If I can buy the Alchemist Stone from them and give it to one of these alchemists that I'm going to recruit, and then I'm going to be at like 50 gold a fire gem. And then I can, hey guys, I'll, to the chat, I'll buy fire gems from you for 35 a gem. That's a pretty good deal for most people. But now for me, I'm getting an extra 15 gold per gem or something or more. It's crazy. So that alchemy point here, this is actually pretty good. Normally it's not but at least having it is really, really good, or can be really, really good. Moving on, so you have your Servant of the Oracles. This is a pretty important mage for the nation. I know his paths aren't fantastic. Him having Holy 2 is kind of cool, so he can bless your blind fighters. And if you take magic leadership in your bless, likely this guy's going to be the one moving your troops around because it has acceptable leadership. But then giving it magic leadership means it can also move your blind fighters. But what is important about him is almost entirely that he has Astral 1 as a path. This nation really, really, really needs an Astral 2, Earth 2 at some point. And while this character might not be the one to do that, this is probably the guy that's going to site search that Astral 1 path to give you the pearls to empower into the Astral 2 path, Earth 2 path, the Astral 2 Earth 2 combo, and do things. So that it's actually very critical that this guy has Astral 1, so you are going to want a lot of these. Unfortunately, if it hits that fire random, you're going to kind of be sad again, just like the Alchemist. So it does kind of suck a little bit that they have that. But the other two randoms are not bad because an Earth 2 or a Death 2 is never really a bad mage. Maybe it'll be expensive for what it's got, but it's not necessarily bad. Now, the final recruitable mage is the Chthonian Necromancer. Obviously, this is your cap only, the most important part of your nation. And by default, it is already good because it is an Earth 2 and a Death 2. Gives you some choices on how do you want to field it. And then it can get some random. So if it gets a fire random, to me, it's a pretty good site searcher with that fire random. But obviously, it can also stand in for a fire random alchemist. You know, you're not guaranteed to get any of these on demand, right? So if you need fire 2 and you get a fire 2 random this, it is what it is. You got to send him out to cast flaming arrows. If you get an Earth random, he's suddenly Earth 3, and Earth 3 means you can do whatever you want. You can cast Army of Gold, you can cast Weapons of Sharpness, you can cast turn 1 Maws of the Earth, you can do whatever you want. That's pretty damn good. Earth 3 is amazing. If you get Death 3, Death 3 is amazing. You can do a bunch of fancy stuff. If you get Astral 1, I mean, you need at least one Astral 1 guy so you can empower him to Astral 2, and then he can build a Starshine Skullcap, he can build a Crystal Coin, he can summon golems. It's very important. You need one other Astral 1 during a small window of the game. Well, small or large, depending on how you want to play it. During a window of the game, you need an Astral 1 because you need a Fire 1 Astral 1 to be able to cast Solar Eclipse. So you need at least 2 of these at some point in your game, because obviously you don't want your empowered mage out there fighting and potentially dying, even if he is twice-born. You don't want a twice-born. Let me actually talk about that now. Most of these are going to be Old Age. You do not want to twice-born them. You can twice-born the one you empower, and you can twice-born one that gets a double random. But you don't want to twice-born these on average because this nation, and we'll talk about it later, most of its most important spells, are they Conjuration, are all going to require these Death Gems, and we'll talk about those soon. And you're in the late age of Dominions 5 that traditionally has very low amount of gems. And you need these summons to survive later on in the game. You do not want to spend them twice-borning these guys. Again, really rare ones or ones you've empowered, sure, go for it. But you ideally don't want to be twice-borning these guys. And that's a wrap for your recruitable mages, and we're next going to talk about your summons, your items, and at least 1 or 2 of your heroes. Alrighty, so let's talk about Late Age Agartha's summonable units and their heroes. We're going to start with their heroes first because it is quick and easy. This is being played with the Worthy Heroes mod, which I think recently I have joined my first game that actually doesn't have it, which is crazy to me. And it sucks because I planned around it, and now it's not there. But moving forward, I want to say I'm probably always going to have this on. And it's such a minor mod, and it only does good for you. Anyways, you have Urquhart von Kolbrum, and this guy has the potential to be probably one of the more broken heroes around in the game, almost entirely because he has Alchemist. Oh gosh, I can't even click it. Alchemist 100. So everything I just said about the other Alchemists, this guy makes it even worse. So if this guy were to try to convert gems later in the game, and you give him a bunch of fire boosters, he is going to make you actual bank. The issue is that he is insane, so you don't really want him in your capital in case he decides to demolish your fort or burn your temple. or pillage it or something. You want to move him somewhere else. And he's old age, and he might get diseased and die. And if you twice born him, you don't keep this alchemist ability. You just keep these pats, which, hey, don't get me wrong, those pats are pretty good. So, were I you, and I get this guy early, I move him to a second fort. I try to make sure that he can get there in one turn, and I just have him research. If he can't make it in there in one turn, just keep him researching because 35 research for one dude is pretty good. And you want to try to keep him alive until later in the game so that he can abuse this Alchemist 100. Usually only pretenders have this good alchemy. So this will completely break the game in terms of how much gold you can get for things. Absolutely busted hero. 10 out of 10. uh, Let me actually talk real quick. I know I mentioned before you don't want to twice born your capital only mages, and you don't want to twice born this guy. You don't want to twice born anything. All your death gems need to be spent on your summons to keep you alive. But with a tiny exception of obviously like items, you can have exceptions for items. There's one item in particular that a lot of players forget it exists, and it's actually pretty critical to this nation to handle all your people being old. At Construction 6, there is an eye pendant that costs Earth and Death, and it gives you Disease Healer. It gives you some other things too, but no one cares. We want it to give you Disease Healer. And that's how you're going to keep your dudes alive. Before that item, there's that Thaumaturgy spell where you can light yourself on fire and burn away your disease. You can technically do that. Just make sure you give your person at least 20 to 25 fire resistance so they come out okay. Just a ring of fire and maybe like a fire helmet, they should be okay. But yeah, this guy is absolutely busted for his alchemy ability. Early on, he can be very useful for his research ability. Don't send him into combat if you can help it. And yeah, just do your best to keep him alive. You want to pray that you get this guy later when you have that penned item. You don't want to get this guy on turn 10 and then he dies of disease on turn 20. That sucks. That really, really sucks. The second one you can get, and I think this one, I think that Urquhart guy is vanilla. I think these guys are worthy heroes. Essentially, it's just an immortal dude. They can be fire 1 to fire 3. He's got shit stats, but pretty good protection. You know, he's immortal. He's got resistances. Hey, it's an immortal little thug to mess around with. He blows up when he dies. These guys are super duper fun. I don't think they really change anything critical in the nation. They give you fire. They have a potential to be fire 3. And that can actually be pretty cool. That can be useful. But, you know, fire 3 is not that critical of a thing anyways. You can get flame spirits. I mean, this literally is a flame spirit. It's just, it thought that your nation blowing itself up was cool, so it decided to join up to blow itself up in perpetuity because it's immortal. And it's mindless, so it's not going to get soul slayed. So yeah, this guy can be pretty cool. You can probably do things later on that make this like an S tier superhero kind of thing if you empower it in other crap and abuse the fact that it's mindless immortal. You can probably break the game. But for now, I wouldn't concern yourself with it. Just see this as a disposable fire mage thug that just goes around and does mischief. But potentially this could be broken. But until then, it's pretty fun. And that's your heroes. Short and sweet. Let's talk then about your actual summons. So your summons are very plentiful for Dominions 5 vanilla. We're going to start with your Iron Ancestor. So this is a 3 Earth Gem commander that you can summon and lead your troops with, lead your undead with. It can go and hold certain items. We'll talk about that later. And it can equip things and take advantage that it has 19 protection, 25 hit points, acceptable stats, and just go kick ass. For 3 Earth Gems, this is not bad at all. And most likely you're going to have it lead, if you choose to use these Iron Corpses. So this is the troop version of that guy. It has less hit points, less protection, significantly less stats, and really requires a lot of help to get going. The benefit that these guys have is under the right conditions. With some of the buffs that you naturally have access to in this nation, this can actually be a monster on the battlefield, which you don't care if it lives or dies. So for the most part, these are pretty terrible, but under the right conditions, they can be good. You just always need to be scared of later in the game when you have access to the things that make this a monster. You just need to very much worry about this poor magic resistance, a base of 7, because Undead Mastery is a thing that exists. It is not cast often, but it can be. And if that happens after this guy has received all the buffs in the world, you're going to be in for a bad time. Now, to your... Oh, wait. Let's keep talking about your crappy summons. So, Flame Corpses are just an explosive version of that last guy, and you should never, ever make this. This guy is complete trash. Don't make it. The reason is because his combat speed is so slow, it's going to actually be behind your units often, which is impressive considering how slow Agarthan units are. And that means when it does die, because it will die with its terrible stats, it's going to likely blow up your units and not the enemies. The alternative is the Flame Barrel Nightmare, which is now that fire barrel is into a horse, and the combat speed is 24. This is not a perfect summon. This is a meme summon, but there are situations where it can be good, and I kind of like them because they're going to run forward. They blow up in a larger area than the other guy to start with. That helps too. But they're going to be able to be placed in front of your army, rush forward, and blow up in the enemy lines, often before buffs come out. It's not going to do a lot of damage, but it's going to do damage, and depending on what unit it is, it could actually probably do a lot of damage. So these I actually like. I think these are pretty cool, pretty good. The big issue I have with them is that it's hard to get them. You can only get one at a time. They cost you 2 fire gems each, which can technically be expensive for a suicidal unit. But the main thing is just that you get them one at a time. So you need to sacrifice a lot of mage research and mage turns just to get them in a large enough mass that matters. Now, I think that's most of their crappy units. Just a quick mention. You see, like, this is one of your summonable units, the Tomb Oracle. It's your best summon commander. It comes with Earth 3, Death 3. Let me take these boots off by default. And Holy 3, which is very good. Let me just deep dive onto him real quick. He is a reanimator, so you can give him an Amulet of the Dead, and he will reanimate 10 skeletons a turn. So essentially you pay 30 to 35 death gems, depending if you use a hammer on the amulet or not. And then you get a return of 10 skeletons per turn if you have him reanimate. Might not be the best use of him, depends on your situation, who knows. A lot of people don't like this because they compare it to a Lich or a Wraithlord, and I think those people are dumb. This is not a Lich, this is not a Wraithlord, this is a Mound Fiend. A lot of people don't even know what a Mound Fiend is. It's a Death 3, Holy 2 that reanimates. It costs 28 death gems at Conjuration 6. This guy costs 30 death gems at Conjuration 6. This is a Mound Fiend. It is not a Lich, it is not a Wraithlord, it is a Mound Fiend. For a Mound Fiend, Earth 3, Death 3, Holy 3, with 85 hit points, and all these stats and resistances is really freaking good. This guy can be used to either replace, I wouldn't say permanently replace, but they can, in an army, they can replace the position of your cap only, the Chthonian Necromancer, and actually in often cases do better than it by having these higher base paths, and be Holy 3 to bless everything. They can also be super combatants, they can be thugs, they can do a bunch of crazy shit. They're such a powerful mage that you might not even need to give them a melee weapon, a real melee weapon. They can just keep this quarterstaff to repel things, and then just cast Iron Marionette to give itself 16 attack, repel things more, and then just go ahead and cast Leeching Darkness, Horde of Skeletons, Shadow Blasts, Maws of the Earth, whatever it wants. This thing is really freaking good. It is just expensive. It is 30 death gems. This is why you don't want to twice spawn anything. You need a lot of death gems. And why I talked about this now, due to the Iron Corpses, my train of thought. The benefit the Iron Corpses has, if you get a lot of them, this 40 is just one cast of this guy with Earth 4, summoning them with the later game spell. And that's why that's kind of like a benefit that they have. They're not the greatest, but you get a lot of them at once. Their siege strength is pretty good, although you have that covered with zappers, but it just depends how you want to approach it. Now, let's talk about their real summons, like the ones that are actually going to make a difference. You have a Shard Wight, and what a Shard Wight is a summonable wight, the basic wight, which is more commonly seen as Banes. It's just that with a better weapon, it's going to be a two-handed glaive that I think it inflicts curse, right? Yeah, and that's pretty cool. Maybe later on you have Doom, which curses the enemy army anyways, but that can be pretty good. But the main thing is that it hits really hard. It has a weapon that can repel. It is pure amphibian instead of poor amphibian, so it can go underwater with no penalties. Although when it does the slashing attack, that will be penalized underwater, but the piercing won't. It's fairly resistant. It has the regular stuff that a Bane's going to have. High strength, no encumbrance, a lot of hit points. I think less protection than a white, but that's okay. The main thing is that since it has this two-handed weapon that hits really hard, and it's undead, you can give it Iron Marionettes to boost its attack by 4. And then at that point, it's going to repel very well. It's going to hit very consistently. And it has that chill aura, which a lot of nations lately, as I've been playing, I haven't noticed a lot of cold resistance on units. So this overall, although it is not sacred, is a very powerful unit. And let me just make a Skull Staff and do a summon, because later on you can get a lot of these. And this is one of the reasons you might not even need a Bless later if you go... Oh, shoot. Look at that. Death 5. Maybe we should have a Pretender do this, because I don't have Death 5 on this guy. Let me send this guy back. I don't have a lab. Okay, let me pause it while I handle it. Okay. Handled it, got my Pretender, back onto the field. It did one summon or one cast of Halls of the Dead, and I got 40 of these guys. That's absolutely insane. Of course, you just saw it is difficult to do this. It is Death 5 and Earth 1. But you will get 20 undead, and then you get 4 for extra level you are. So this Pretender is a Death 10. So it's going to get 20 additional Shard Whites for the same price that someone else would pay. Now, again, this is a crazy mean Pretender I ran into my game. I wanted to try a Fear Bless. I wanted to see what happens if I do Halls of the Dead a lot with a Death 10. 40 Shard Whites a turn is absolutely insane, since they're going to be very resistant to things like Flames from the Sky. They're going to be resistant, or actually they're going to be immune to Murdering Winter. They're going to perform well in darkness. They can't get foul vapored, and they hit very hard with magic weapons. This is a perfect late game unit. Alternatively, you might also just be casting, Legion of Whites, but it is more expensive. It scales worse, and it just gives you a traditional white. So that's the Shard White. That's one of your key units. You have the Umbrals and the Penumbrals, and the Penumbral is just a worse Umbral that you have access to earlier. If you saw my game, there was a moment where I made a bunch of these really quickly. I made like 30 in a turn, because I just wanted insurance against any memes or unexpected things that late age TNG might have had against me. They have an armor piercing attack, they have hit points, they have decent stats, they just have no protection. And they really need to fix that protection. And actually, I said their stats are decent. No, their stats are terrible. It's a base of 10 on both sides. Given their non-existent protection and 10 attack, 10 defense, 30 hit points is not enough. But they're map move 20 and they're stealthy. Really, you just summon these in an emergency like I did. The one you want is the Umbral, which now has a little bit more than twice the hit points. It has 20% better stats, being attack 12 and defense 12. And everything else is about the same. It's got the same size, or it's got bigger size, size 4 instead of size 3, and that's pretty significant. Because size 3, you can put 2 to a square. Here, it can only do 1. But the map move is the same. The strength is a lot higher, so this life drain attack is a lot more effective. It's got high enough morale, it might not be repelled often, despite being length 0. But that's okay, you can berserk it, if anything. But the main thing is these units are very deadly, but they really need buffs in order to work well. Once you get Army of Gold and Quickness and Strength Giants on these guys, they're absolute monsters. They're hitting for 26 armor-piercing damage. It's life-draining into their own hit points, which they have enough that they can tank hits with, especially with Army of Gold. You can even give them Wave Warriors. If you give them 20 protection and Wave Warriors, so they have all the resistances to melee damage, these guys are trucks. Yeah, their damage is going to stay at 22 because, Strength of Giants is +4, Wave Warriors is -4, so it stays here. That's really damn good. This is a really damn good unit, but it needs help. You can't send this alone, or as you saw in my latest Agartha gameplay, on their own they just get shredded. The alternative to Umbral and the Shard White, because I don't think you should get all 3 of these, is the Sepulchral. And the Sepulchral is just a sacred, massive Shard White. This is an ancient Pale one. It's got 69 hit points, nice. A crap ton of strength, really good stats, good mat move, high magic resistance, high morale, acceptable protection. It's sacred and has all these undead things, including amphibian. It has a very damaging length 4 weapon, 41 a swing base at 14 attack base. Well, I guess it has 1 experience, so it would be 13 attack base. You can give this Iron Marionettes, and it's going to take it up to a 17 attack base. And this thing is absolute monster. It is ridiculously good. The problem comes when you want to summon them. And this is kind of where the big, I guess, thought problem on how you spend your gems as Late Age Agartha. You don't have infinite death gems, especially in a traditional Late Age game. You know, lately I've been seeing a lot of Late Age games have higher gem percentages, like Middle Age or Early Age amounts. But in a traditional Late Age game, you don't have infinite death. You have to pick and choose. So you have to choose, do you want Shard Whites? Do you want Sepulcrals? Or do you want Umbrals? You have to pick one, maybe two. I don't think you should pick all three of them. And this is where the issue comes. Umbrals cost you 2 death gems each, and you get 4 at a time. So you get 4 per 8. Sepulcrals cost you twice as much. So you can have 1 Sepulchral for 2 Umbrals. But you only get 1 at a time. So you need double the mages to be able to summon them. Halls of the Dead is the completely opposite. You just need 1 really, really, really big mage. Give him every booster you can find on that 1 big mage and just summon as much. And of course, this is kind of like where the cool part of Agartha is you get to design or decide which path you want to take. Do you want to bless? If so, you probably want Sepulcrals. Do you not care about a bless? Well, do you want Umbrals or do you want Shard Whites? It's choice. They're both really good. Or all 3 of them are really good, actually. Sorry. And they all synergize very well with the nation. They all have these cold auras, though, which is, again, one of the things I was talking about the blind fighters, in that if you want to use blind fighters alongside these units, they will need cold resistance. And if you notice, again, the Umbral and the Sepulchral are both size 4, which means you can fit a blind fighter in a square with them. But to do so, in the case of the Sepulchral, they need to have cold resistance, or else they're just going to fatigue out and die. They're going to do that anyways, but, you know, it is what it is. And the last summon that I want to talk about is going to be the Living Mercury. I want to have it alongside the Water Elemental, so maybe I'll do some sort of battle in the background for you guys to watch. But essentially, this summon comes through an item that you craft at Construction 6. It costs water and nature. It costs water and earth. It costs water and earth. And it's going to be a retinue item that your commander holds, and at the start of every battle, it will unleash a brand new Living Mercury, which is just going to run forward and attack things. It's not scriptable. This is pretty cool because you get a new one every fight. It's kind of like summoning, it's almost a water bottle, essentially, which is why I want to compare it to a water elemental. So this guy starts with more hit points, a smaller size, and a hell of a lot more strength than a water elemental. It does only 3 attacks instead of 4, but that's okay because those 3 attacks hit harder. And then it trades its fire resistance with a Poison Cloud ability. And this is one of the reasons this one is so interesting, because the mage that summons it, even if poison resistance is in your bless, might want to be poison resistant because the Poison Cloud effect could hit him before your bless does. So this is actually a good thing that your Iron Ancestors, the 3 Earth Gem Commander, can actually hold and use. But of course, your regular dudes can do it too. Just be aware that they might get poisoned. Once they actually go into combat, that Poison Cloud is really, really good. It traditionally will beat, 5 poison resistance. It'll not do too much against 10, but 5 it can still do hits. Now, it's one of the reasons that your blind fighters should probably have poison resistance themselves, because they're going to join in the fight at some point and fight alongside this thing, and you don't want them to get poisoned. Granted, you probably want poison resistance in your bless anyways, because foul vapors is a thing, and it will completely wipe your armies otherwise. Regardless, this thing is deadly as all heck. because these crush attacks are armor piercing, meaning armor is half as good against it. So once you get this guy and you buff it, you give it quickness, you give it some sort of protection, like Marble Warriors, Iron Warriors, whatever it is. You give it Strength of Giants, it could potentially be hitting 6 times a turn for 32 armor piercing crushing damage. If a crushing attack hits the head of a unit, it's going to do 50% more damage. And since it's size 5, if it's fighting smaller units, it has a higher head hitting chance. So this thing is a monster. And here's another thing. Because it is size 5, you can actually enlarge it. If you have nature magic somewhere, if you enlarge it and give it Strength of Giants, you're talking plus 7 damage. It is 35 armor piercing damage per swing. If you quicken it, if you give it protection, you can see where I'm going on how disgusting this unit is. And because it is present on turn 1, you don't have a mage summoning it. It's actually very easy to buff. The issue is, again, that it's going to try to run forward. It's going to try to run forward, so you might miss your buffs on it, and it might not always spawn in the same spot. So maybe your mage prioritizes targeting something else, or your formation is so thick, I guess, or so tight that this guy spawns on the other side of your army instead of near your mage. So there is a little bit of a finickiness around these guys and where they're going to start positioned. But because they start at combat, you don't need to cast Water Elemental to get them. They're a lot easier to buff, and they're absolute monsters when buffed. I think they're stronger than Water Elementals, and they take buffs better. The only issue, again, is they come through an item, and that Poison Cloud could potentially kill the item's wielder right at the beginning because the item does not provide any poison resistance. Not to mention that if you do want to use these, now your blind fighter will also need poison resistance. Your undead don't care. Your undead already have it. One other thing to note, if you're going to use your chill aura undead, like your shard whites and your sepulchrals, then this guy needs cold resistance because he doesn't have it. So it's, again, these are hoops you have to jump through in order to do the things that most nations just do automatically. But if you do jump through them, you do get rewarded in that this thing is an absolute monster. You just got to get there to use it. So to give some recommended spells for the nation, I'm always going to recommend Solar Eclipse and Darkness because every unit you have either has perfect dark vision or partial dark vision, which means that you're not going to get as affected by these spells as the enemy likely is. Spirit Sight is a pretty common plus nowadays, so is Low Light Vision. But odds are your enemy might not have it, and you will. Flaming Arrows is the quintessential ranged weapon but spell, and it's quite easy for you to cast, especially if you get some lucky randoms. Legions of Steel, Strength of Giants, Earth Meld, Maws of the Earth. These are all the traditionally good Earth Magic spells, and you're going to have Earth Magic by the droves. You're going to have so much of it, you're going to be even spamming Iron Warriors, which is not on this list, but it's still a very good spell. Later on, you might want to start casting Rigor Mortis. It depends on how many undead are actually in your army. One of the key things people talk about your living units, your blind fighters, is their encumbrance is so high. Under Rigor Mortis, everybody's encumbrance is so high, it doesn't really matter. And if your army is a majority undead, be it your Chthonian Ancestor guys, regular long dead that your mages summoned, shard whites, sepulchrals, umbrals, yeah, you're not going to get too affected by Rigor Mortis, but your enemy definitely will. Acid spells are a non-traditional spells that get used because the water fire path tends to be very rare, but you have it on all your alchemists. And although they don't have a lot of synergy with your human units because you don't want to melt their armor, a lot of your undead either don't have armor or they have bronze armor. So it doesn't really matter. And acid tends to be an unresistible spell type. It's going to do some armor piercing damage, but there's no resistance that reduces that. So it's always going to be good. Especially later on, the acid rain spell. I've used it before to kill people that just weren't expecting me to cast it. So a lot of the times when it gets mentioned in a thread or a forum, people just say, oh, well, I'll just cast any protection spell and it's not going to do any damage. That's not necessarily true. I've had people under Army of Gold with 20 protection die to a bad roll of Acid Rain because people forget when they're doing their math that it's going to do 4 armor piercing damage. That's true, but it's going to do 4 armor piercing damage the entire battle, and Agarthan battles tend to be very slow. So your battle is if you got 100 turns of 4 armor piercing damage, even people with 20 protection might start dying. It has a little bit of anti-synergy with Horde of Skeletons, which is your next spell, but in certain cases, it might be worth it to cast Acid Rain, or I think it's Acid Storm is the battlefield-wide one, I'm sorry, just because it might catch the opponent off guard and kill their mages. Otherwise, you can cast Acid Rain or Acid Bolt or whatever, which are the more localized evocations that your mages can do, and those are pretty damn deadly. Horde of Skeletons is the final one because you can't have a Death Nation without talking about Horde of Skeletons. All of your Chthonian Reanimators can do it, your Earth 1, Death 2 guys. And it's a pretty fantastic spell in almost every case. You're never really sad to be casting it unless your opponent is casting Flamestorm or Acid Storm or something. Lady Agartha has 4 minigames that they need to pursue. The first and most important is nature. It's critical that Lady Agartha finds some way to have strong nature mages by the mid-game in order to defend themselves against foul vapors, which is the natural counter to this nation, at least early on when their armies are primarily masses of humans. Late game, nature is going to be critical as well because it's going to provide the spell relief. Lady Agartha likely wants to be casting Rigor Mortis in their plays, and their armies might not be entirely immune to it. The second path that Lady Agartha should be following is going to be fire. Fire is actually going to be kind of easy for the nation because you do have Fire 2 mages and the Fire Death crosspath, and that's all you need. Fire is going to be important because late age games tend to revolve around larger armies than other ages, and Flames from the Sky is a particularly deadly spell. The next minigame for Late Age Agartha is going to be Water. Water can actually be done fairly easily as well, but I do want to highlight how important it would be, and likely that the easiest way to do it would be the spell Streams from Hades to get yourself Coquithiads. You're going to need some Construction 6 gear and a Water 2 mage, but you have both of those, and that's going to be very critical for yourself later, as you don't tend to have a lot of demons, but the enemy will. And you need to be able to cast Demon Cleansing in order to defend yourself against most late age armies. There's also a lot of synergy in Demon Cleansing and Rigor Mortis, which you're already casting. Alternatively, there's spells like Needful Flames that could help defeat enemy armies that are not completely cold resistance, whereas ideally in the late game, you're fielding a lot of undead, which already are. Other spells such as Wave Warriors can help solidify your front line. The last minigame that Nation really needs to go up, and it doesn't need to go up too far, is going to be Astral. The Astral minigame traditionally is linked with Earth Magic. Thankfully, you do have both, so all I'm doing here is just highlighting that your nation really, really wants to have golems in the late game. Their most important job being anti-magic. Their second most important job likely being Will of the Fates or Battle Fortune, depending on how many humans or living creatures you do have in your armies. And then the third job could potentially be raiding, which Agartha isn't traditionally good at, but they do have other ways of doing it. Overall, Late Age Agartha is a pretty interesting nation, and they have standard tools, but those tools begin to branch out in very unique ways as the game progresses. I think their early game is very, very strong. I think right out the gate, they can definitely swarm people with a lot of very powerful crossbowmen and durable infantry. And then they're going to be very quick to siege and break forts because they do have sappers. I think their mid game is when they start running into issues because they might not be fully transitioned into a powerful army of undead or sacreds. And they're very vulnerable to dying to wipes like Foul Vapors or Winds of Death. I think they're okay against things like Flamestorm because of their armor, but often you might not have armored crossbowmen to deal with that. So I think their mid game is a little bit precarious, but they're definitely a nation that wants to expand quickly right out the gate, conquer someone immediately, press their advantage, and then make peace with everyone around them and just kind of chill out for a while. Get past that middle game hump until they can rejoin the late mid game with an army of sacreds, which hopefully have some bless that keeps them alive, alongside some powerful undead that are going to get buffed by very good earth magic or water magic. And then they just keep pushing that advantage. At the very tail end of the game, they're going to start falling off a little bit because they don't have blood magic. And what they're really going to do is all the gold that they have from not having to blood hunt, from not having to have blood hunters, is going to go into more units, more mages, and more research. And that can be pretty good. So for a traditional game, I think Lady Jagartha is fine, but they do have a very precarious timing around the middle of the game where they're not too strong. And the problem is that that timing actually coincides with a lot of the timings for other nations to be very strong. And that could be a problem. The biggest issue I have with the nation is that they have a lot of tools, and a lot of the tools are actually very good. But due to the circumstances of being in the late age, accessing those tools in good enough numbers becomes difficult. And on top of that, the tools that are easy to access, like the blind fighter, for example, there's hoops to jump through in order to use it, in that it's a magic being, so that your traditional commanders can't do it. You need commanders specific to lead it, or using your mages in combat, which you might not want to do early or in enough numbers to field enough blind fighters. Yes, you can take an arcane command bless, but again, the blind fighter isn't such a good unit that it demands an arcane command bless. Other nations don't have to jump through these hoops in order to use their sacreds, so I don't feel it's particularly fair that Agartha does. That said, also, some of the later synergies of the nation, or should I say anti-synergies of the nation, require you to formulate your bless almost entirely around them. If you want to use your sacred blind fighters alongside shard whites or sepulcrals, they need to be cold resistant. If you want to use mercury barrels, well, they need to be poison resistant too. You don't necessarily need to use the blind fighters. I just think that if you rely solely on sacred armies or just undead, I don't think you're going to have enough troops out in the field to be able to effectively fight your enemies. So, I'm not sure where I'd place this nation. It's definitely not as bad as people say it is, but it's not very good either just because it has so many hurdles to jump through in order to do what it's good at, and I don't feel a lot of other nations have those same hurdles to do. It's kind of weird. It's definitely a good nation overall, and I do look forward to playing it again. And I hope that this quite long national overview has helped you gotten some insight on maybe some of the things the nation plays that you might not have considered, or just excited you to play Lady Agartha in a future game. And once you do that, please do me the favor. If you do play Lady Agartha and you find some cool things out, please go ahead and add it to the comments below. Let's talk about it. Let's get this nation on the map. I think it's pretty good. I think it's pretty fun. I think people have fun playing it. And hopefully, if there are some necessary changes to be made, maybe a lot more people playing Lady Agartha, giving it some, presentations, can get some changes put in. Like, I think swapping this full leather armor to a ring mail would be really good, getting that extra mat move, getting that extra defense point. Swapping the shield to a kite shield would be good. Removing the magic being tag from blind fighters. Maybe giving cold resistance to mercury barrels, or mercury elementals would be good too. The little things. With that, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time.